to ask us to think about, ecological reparations is to pose a question of the kind of the medium and the entangling mediums, right? And the kind of implicated and complicated and complicitizing, necessarily embedded all the time kinds of mediums and modes of repair, that reparation must happen in situ, right? It happens in place, it happens in sites, sort of through the materials and fabrics and the elements of living, right? And I think for me, having been trying to think about and think with, air and breath and breathing and the question of what it means and takes to breathe together, and how that's not an obvious thing, but rather something that prompts you to ask more questions about what that actually means and requires, right? That it begs the question of what repair takes, right? What kinds of attunements, what kinds of sensorial modes, what kinds of knowledges, what kinds of feelings, what kinds of collectivities, what kinds of affinities, right? What kinds of mediums and substances through which one can feel and think and imagine kinship or solidarity or conspiracy or collectivity or whatever, right? Like that, the terms by which those will get activated, I think, will matter for how we imagine what repair looks like and what counts as needing repair.
All your recent work is about this idea of atmospheric reckoning, so interrogating, negotiating, navigating our experiences with breathing different types of air in different locations through different groups or in different contexts. So what is atmospheric reckoning for you, and how does it connect to these ideas that you just mentioned about repair and reparation?
Atmospheric reckoning is about giving an account and coming to terms with, and in a sense also grappling with the implications of and terms by which we, meaning whatever we is talking at the time, right, depend on, share, and respire in, and also affect each other's sort of atmospheric surround and the air that one depends on. Maybe in the same way that I was talking about ecological reparation asks us to, think reparations in an ecological mode, right? Atmospheric reckoning to me is also a question of like, all right, what does it mean to think atmospherically about a social problem or about a sort of socio-technical, ecological kind of problem, right? What that means then is one has to think about, say, power, right, in its distributions, in its condensations, in its forms of suspension, like that the kind of, for lack of a better word right now, the materialities of and the qualities that come with powers and problems that are enacted atmospherically mean that like the terms by which one reckons with them and then maybe can think and do politics, right, have to themselves also be the word I'm thinking of is like mounted by, because I'm thinking of spirit possession, right? But they have to be possessed by atmosphere themselves, right?
You've talked a bit through, in your other words, about questions of environmental justice, but in a way that gives this atmospheric quality to them, or the way we can talk atmospherically about environmental justice. I mean, that's what I was reading, what you were just saying. And I think there is something also about your notion of the breather. What's a breather? Like I could ask you what kind of political subject is a breather, but that's not what I want to ask. What I want to ask is for you, what is that breather and how are breathers connected to each other? What kind of again, a bad word would be to say, what kind of subjectivity is the breather? But no, I know you're going to say it in another word, but what is a breather for you?
I like how you asked the question that, there's all these words to avoid, because I think for me, the breather has been a way to avoid a lot of words. A breather is a subject. If I hail you as a breather, I'm not hailing you in your intention, right? I'm not hailing you in your capacity to reason or to argue, naming the substrate of your living, but also mine, right? But also begging the question all the time of how that kind of a generalization is too much, right? It's a sort of, it's simultaneously for me, a very thin term and very thick term, right? Because it's quite substantial and affecting to be made conscious of one's breathing, to have that thick and present and conscious, right? It's a kind of experience near term. It's also, it has a kind of poke to it, right? Because it asks me to reckon with that as a fundamental, foregrounded aspect of my day-to-day. But it's also thin, right? Because it's it's a banality, and it's also insufficient just to say, well, everyone breathes, because that would be unhelpful, right? I
want to come back to some of the latest things I've seen of you. We've seen your work, the Museum of Breathers. So talk a little bit about that, because it is a speculative space, both conceptually, and it's also through your writing, but it also visually through your drawing and your comics. So it's a space also where the audience, the museum's audience, and the audience becomes aware of experience of breathing and kinship through air. So there is something about what is this Museum of Breathers doing for you? And I know it does a lot of things, so it might be you could talk for hours about all the different things, but maybe anything you would like to tell us about that would be great.
I sort of imagine a speculative archive, right? And it's it has a kind of curatorial function, and it has a kind of concept formation function. The idea of it, right, is to without much commentary, to present different breathers in their breathing conditions, right? To prompt those questions that we started with, right? Of what is common, what is not, what are the histories and infrastructures and processes that maybe connect different scenes in this museum, and that also maybe segregate them, partition them, hierarchize them, and so on. I can give you 2 concrete scenes, right, of origin for it. The first is the Q&A sessions after talks. If I would talk about atmospheric politics, or the kind of the possibility of thinking thinking collectivity and through a breather, and sort of drawing a comparison between the work of hailing a subject as a breather as opposed to a worker, or and the sort of fraught but generative universalisms that those produce, right? And I just remember, at those times, standing at the podium, just wishing that I could. I used a very non-technical term in another event recently, but I just wished I could smush everything, right, that was in my head, and just sort of, just offer it back, right, to say it's this kind of lumpy aggregation that is what for me is, to be trying to think with breathing and breathers, right? It's not a simplifying abstraction. It is a sort of complicating abstraction. It's one that aggregates sort of more and more things that don't fit together. So that's one scene of origin, is that wish that I could just do that, right? And maybe the second origin is similar. I don't know how much detail to go into it, but there were two things I really wanted to write about at the same time. And I was frustrated because each of them was complex, but to give them their due, it meant they were quite separate spatially on a page, like they were pages apart. And just my way of dealing with it was to draw myself a little drawing that kind of had the two scenes together, just kind of as a guide, right? So that even as I was writing, I'd always know what should be haunting the other. And then it just sort of kept rolling from there. Then I was imagining, oh, I wish I had this museum that I could walk people through, in a sense, so I could communicate better, or so I could convey the feeling of the thought, right, or the image of the thought in a way that felt more satisfying to me. I'd hesitate to call it a limit of language. It was maybe a limit of my language at the time, and maybe a boredom with certain kinds of language.